Hi, this is Zahour from smjuror, and today we're going to be looking at the juror misconduct issues in the case of State versus Benoit, which is out of the Louisiana Appellate Court. Some points that I want to highlight that we're going to discuss are the juror notes to the trial court, pre-deliberation conversations, and the requirement of prejudice. In this case, the defendant was convicted for sexual battery and attempted aggravated incest. He appealed his convictions, and if we focus on the alleged juror misconduct issue, he argued that the trial court erred when it denied his motion for mistrial based on juror misconduct. The basis for that motion was that on the fourth day of trial, the jury sent two notes to the trial court. The first asked to listen to the recording of a jail telephone call, and the second wondered if they could review transcripts during deliberations. The defendant argued that these requests demonstrated a quote-unquote legal defect because, according to him, the jurors must have been deliberating before the state's case even rested, and that was in violation of the trial court's instructions not to discuss the case prior to the completion of trial. So he moved for a mistrial, which was denied. Now, the first thing I want to do is emphasize that a mistrial is a drastic remedy, and it's not going to be granted unless it is warranted when there is trial error which results in substantial prejudice to a defendant, depriving him of a reasonable expectation of a fair trial. The standard of review is the abuse of discretion standard of review. So the appellate court is going to look to see if the trial court abused its discretion when it denied the motion for mistrial. Now, when we're talking about the requirement of showing prejudice, I want to emphasize that juror misconduct is not grounds for an automatic mistrial. This is so important because just because there is some juror misconduct does not mean that you get a do-over. Prejudice must be established. And that's because there is a presumption of jury impartiality in any trial. So, in order to show prejudice, you have to show that there was evidence of some extrinsic factual matter which tainted the jury's deliberations. If you are able to demonstrate this, then you can overcome the presumption of jury impartiality, and then the burden of proof shifts to the state to show that the influence that you demonstrated was not prejudicial or essentially was harmless. Now let's talk about pre-deliberation conversations among jurors. I want to emphasize that they are not extraneous. And this is really important because the whole crux of the juror misconduct issue that the defendant is alleging is that there were intra-jury communications. So the court said that communications among jurors, although they violate the trial court's instructions, do not amount to outside influences or extraneous information. And then the court went on to say that the defendant did not allege any type of facts that suggested that the jury based its verdict on prohibited factors, and it gave two examples, such as coercion by a party or inadmissible evidence of other crimes obtained from an out-of-court source. So if we look at the holding in this case, the appellate court held that the trial court did not abuse its discretion when it denied the motion for mistrial. The appellate court looked at the record, which was very limited on this issue. It stated that the defendant alleged that there was intra-juror communications, but they weren't sure if they took place, and it certainly was not proven. Also, just because there are intra-juror communications, they are not improper outside influences, and there was no evidence of any extraneous prejudicial information or any objective verifiable misconduct. And so the trial court properly denied the motion for mistrial. Now let's take a look at some case-specific facts which are pivotal to the outcome of the case. The first is that the defendant alleged but did not prove that there was any intra-jury communication. So we're really talking about speculation here. Now, the defendant did not attach any kind of support to his motion other than the fact that we know that he was talking about the 2 notes that the jury sent to the trial court. But there were not any jury affidavits. There was not jury testimony. Now, whether or not those affidavits or testimony could be admitted is another issue. But what I want to point out is that the defendant did not present any of that type of evidence. There was no evidence from any witnesses about any communications, and there certainly wasn't any documentation other than the fact that the notes were sent to the trial court. So the appellate court was really inquiring as to where the proof of any kind of misconduct was in the first place. Next, it's important to know the rules. The law indicates that intra-jury communications are not extraneous. This is the entire crux of the defendant's case, and as such, the defendant did not prove that there was any extraneous influence on the jury. So again, there is no indication of misconduct or that any event was prejudicial in the jury rendering their verdict. And then finally, the defendant has not demonstrated any prejudice stemming from the jury's requests in their notes to the trial judge. And so essentially, the defendant has not met his burden of proof. But I want to dig a little deeper and talk about the different levels of where the defendant did not meet his burden of proof. The first is that he focused on the jury notes that were sent to the trial court. There's no indication that doing so is any type of jury misconduct. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that he bases his whole jury misconduct argument on intra-jury communications. We know from the law that intra-jury communications are not extraneous. Therefore, there's not any kind of extraneous influence on the jury. Essentially, then we also know that there was no evidence of what the substance of these communications would have been. The argument is entirely speculative, and so we don't even know how these conversations could have prejudiced the jury. So there's no proof on the element of prejudice as well. So the defendant has not met his burden of proof with respect to demonstrating juror misconduct or that it was prejudicial. And more importantly, he did not have the burden of proof shift to the state to show that the jury actions were somehow non-prejudicial. Now, this is really important because a lot of times when a party alleges juror misconduct, they want to somehow shift the burden before they have met the burden themselves. So I just want you to be mindful of that if you find yourself in that type of circumstance. So that is it for our case law analysis of the juror misconduct issues in this case. Again, this is Nilgün Zahour from smjuror. Thanks for watching, because the only evidence that you want the jury to consider is in the courtroom. See you next time.